Did you vote in the last election? Chances are you probably didn't. Even though California is the most populated state, as shown on this map, and its population is still growing, low voter turnout is a serious problem, meaning not a lot of people are going out on election day and casting their votes. In order to create a more politically and civically engaged state, it's essential to understand why low voter turnout is a problem, who does and doesn't vote, and what barriers are in the way of people voting. It's also important to know about the lack of youth engagement in California, what's been done to make voting easier and why it hasn't worked, as well as what are some potential solutions to increasing voter turnout in the future. Arturo, why is low voter turnout something we should even care about?
That's a good question, Angela. People not voting or caring is important to discuss because voting is a massive part of our nation and is arguably the most important part that makes the United States so uniquely different, for better or for worse. The Constitution states that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And we have come a long way to making sure this is upheld and no one is discriminated against their ability to vote on change they want for the government they live in. Here are two images kind of showing the voter turnouts and how the youth mainly are way more likely to not vote than people over the age of 65. The difference there is very drastic. And the pie chart on the right kind of shows you the people who don't vote, what they report on why they don't vote. And over half of it is because they're just not interested or refuse to. Interestingly though, voter turnout has been rising over time. As of 2014, right here, it kind of shows you that, and these numbers actually right at 2014 were record-breaking lows, and after that they started skyrocketing up, and now they're almost at record-breaking highs. However, there's a bigger underlying issue with people wanting to vote, and what I mean is the difference between participation and engagement. And what I mean by this is that someone can participate in something without actually caring about what they're participating in, but someone can't really engage with something without being interested in the topic. The same can be said for voting. Someone can vote or show up to the polls on election day without really caring who they voted on. And this is really well summarized by a Reuters poll that was conducted in 2018. This poll shows that now more than ever, people are voting purely based on what party they identify with. And moreover, people are now starting to vote for their party just so that they are not voting for the other party and basically spiting them with their vote. As Mark Hetherington, a professor of political science, puts it, people aren't voting for their side as much as they are voting against the other side. It doesn't really matter what the names are these days. This quote shows that there's a huge problem with how politics is being handled by the general population nowadays. The political scene has changed from a place where people can share ideas and collaborate to a place where people just hate each other and refuse to compromise at all. Moreover, a PRI research page from 2018 shows that over 2/3 of Americans are pessimistic about talking to the opposing party in order to fix the nation's problems. And I'm quite certain that this number is much higher nowadays, considering the events of 2018. And so that's why we want to really focus on getting people to care about their vote and what they're voting for, rather than just voting on whatever party they are comfortable with. But now a question for Kaylie. Can you give us a little more insight on who is voting, who is not, and why?
That's a great question. In regards to voting in California, there is a huge gap between voters. One of the main factors to this gap is based on race and ethnicity. Mark Belisar, President and Chief Executive Officer of Public Policy Institute of California, says surveys over the past year indicate that among adult citizens, 47% of Latinos, 54% of Asian Americans, and 54% of African Americans are likely to vote, compared to 65% of non-Hispanic whites. This shows us that non-Hispanic whites are way more likely to vote than any other race. And we take a look at this chart right here. It says that racial and ethnic groups have spiked a bit during the 2018 midterm election, which is great to see. But there is also still a huge gap between the white population and the population of minorities when it comes to voting. Another factor that contributes to the gap is a person's age. Throughout the years, it's been proven that people who are way older tend to vote a lot more than their younger counterparts. Though in the last election, we saw a huge spike in voters, which is great to see. Another factor that contributes is a person's income and social status. If someone is living more comfortably, they have a stable income, a home, food on the table, they'll be able to worry and care more about voting than someone who's at a lower social and economic status because they have all the basic necessities. If someone's having a hard time keeping a house, keeping food on the table, and anything else that comes with being poor, they're not going to care as much to vote and to care about politics and politicians because they're caring about the basic necessities and providing for their family. Another factor that we can look at is a person's level of education. A survey shows that people who got college education were way more likely to vote than people who did not get a college education. This is simply because people who understand things and have more knowledge about things are more likely to go and execute that. So if I didn't have any education about voting or politics, then I wouldn't care about voting, and I wouldn't care about voting for a politician that I like. Another factor is a person's gender. It's been apparent that females tend to vote at higher rates than males do. In the U.S. presidential election dating back to 1984, women were reported to having turned out a lot more than males did. This is according to the new analysis of the Census Bureau data by the Center. In a bigger picture than California in 2016, 63% of women who were eligible to vote said that they cast ballots in the presidential election, and only 59% of men did. We will always have factors that set us apart from one another and prompt us in different ways, but our goal here is to make sure that everyone is aware of their right to vote, and everyone is aware that your age, race, education, or gender doesn't matter. And as Thomas Jefferson said, we do not have a government by the majority, we have a government by the majority who participate. And that brings us to Kate. What are some reasons for why people don't vote?
So there are many barriers that prevent people from voting, as well as laws that make it a lot more difficult for certain people to vote. And this graph here shows some reasons why people don't vote, not interested or refused being the main reason. And the first barrier that I'm going to be talking about is difficulty with English, which is the smallest one in this graph, but it's still very important. And this barrier in particular is explained in an article called 11 Barriers to Voting Rights, which was published in 2019 by Carnegie Corporation of New York. One of the most important quotes I found in this article was, "Voting rights groups regularly receive reports that local jurisdictions are not translating materials or offering language assistance as required by law, proving a persistent barrier to increased voting among language minorities." So although there's a law requiring translations and language assistance at voting places, a lot of them are not providing it. So for those whose first language is not English, this makes it really difficult for them. If there are no translations and nobody there to help them, they simply can't vote, even if they want to. They're not going to understand what they're reading or have help understanding who to vote for. And this is a really big issue because there is a law requiring this, but a lot of places are not following through with that. And another really important barrier is age, specifically young people. So why younger people are less likely to vote is explained in an article called "Why Don't Young People Vote and What Can Be Done About It?" And this was published in 2020 by the New York Times. So one important quote from this article was, "There's also an indirect opportunity cost to learning the process of voting, like finding a polling place and learning about the candidates." This is one that's really important and brought up a lot, because learning about politics and how the whole process of voting works isn't taught enough in education systems, and not just that, but isn't talked about enough around people, whether that's in school or outside of school or in groups. And this can lead to less and less youth participating in voting, because if we're not learning about the process of voting at a young age, then when the time of voting comes, people are not going to understand how to do it and have no interest in doing it. And that same thing goes for learning about politics and the people we're voting for. Because if we're not teaching about who those people are, then people are going to have no interest in voting for them. And this brings us to Noah, who's going to tell us more about youth engagement in politics.
Well, Kate, first of all, a youth voter is defined as someone who is between the ages of 18 and 24. Youth engagement is growing, but it still has a long way to go. The Secretary of State's office's California Students Vote Project fact sheet explains what strategies are being used to increase youth voter turnout, and it also tells us how many young people have gone to the polls in past elections. In the 2014 general election, 52% of eligible youth were registered to vote, yet only 8% of them actually went to the polls and voted. As you can see in the 2018 election, 61% of young people were eligible to vote, but only 25% actually got to the polls. Although this is a nice increase from the 2014 election, it still isn't near enough to close more than a 20% gap between us and the overall population. The California Students Vote Project's strategies include asking students to vote via their student portals and sending messages about registration and voting deadlines. They also partnered up with CSU and UC schools to help students register on campus. Although voter turnout is slowly increasing, many others have ideas on how to speed up the process. LA Times online reporter Laura Brill's article, "What California Can Learn from Georgia About Increasing Youth Voter Turnout," argues that we should look at Georgia for solutions for increasing voter turnout because they have doubled the amount of young voters since 2016, and it also gives suggestions for increasing our voter turnout. One suggestion Laura had to increase young voter turnout was for legislature to reintroduce Bill AB 773. It's a 2019 bill that would have required public high schools to help students register or pre-register to vote and teach students about the voting process. This would likely increase our voter turnout because the number of high schoolers pre-registered to vote has declined 5% in the last 2 years. Laura also suggests that the state could improve its online voter registration system, which currently requires an ID or a driver's license. This proves to be extra burdensome because you do not need an ID for registration on paper, but it is required online. It is so important to increase voter turnout among young people because we are one of the least represented groups in politics. If we were able to close the gap between us and the overall population, we would be a political force to be reckoned with. You might just think that voter turnout depends solely on who shows up to the polls on election day, but government legislature also has an effect on who casts their vote.
That is a great point, Noah. There has been a lot of trial and error when it comes to legislation that is meant to increase voter turnout, so it may be time to think outside the box about how to get more Californians to go to the polls and vote. Eric McGee from the Public Policy Institute of California wrote in an article titled California's Missing Voters, Who's Not Voting and Why, that voting by mail and automated voter registration are two solutions that could potentially increase voter turnout in the future. Vote by mail registration helps ensure more consistent participation among voters because it extends the length of time people have to study the ballots. So that allows people to make a more informed decision about who and what to vote for. It is also cost-effective and easier for election officials to keep track of vote-by-mail ballots because all of these ballots would be coming in through the same system. Automated voter registration, on the other hand, allows the DMV system to collect information on eligible voters and electronically transfer this information to the voter registration database. So this streamlined process is very quick and efficient when it comes to transferring voter information. Duncan Hosey and Rob Ritchie, in their 2014 article, What's the Matter with California Turnout?, published by Fair Vote, suggested a number of reforms to raise turnout and foster more civic engagement in California. First, reforming Top 2 with ranked choice voting, or RCV, would ensure that the decisive election occurs when turnout is highest, and would provide voter choice while upholding the basic goals of representative democracy. RCV would open general election races to more than just 2 candidates, allowing for greater competition and more candidates to choose from. Second, shifting to a national popular vote for president would call for more spending and attention to California, raising general election turnout because people's votes would directly determine who wins, so Californians would be more motivated to go out and vote. Third, adopting universal voter registration instead of opt-in voter registration would make California elections more accessible and stimulate high participation. It would provide notably greater protection from disenfranchisement, discrimination, and unfair vote counting standards. Lastly, siding with the fair representation voting will redefine districts, candidates, and seats. This will get rid of imbalances like partisan tilt and will provide voters with more choices that reflect their personal interests and views. Now, some of these vote system reforms may seem unlikely to happen anytime in the next couple of years, and 82% of people agree that legislation will not make any effort to increase and promote greater voter turnout in California. Noah, is there a faster way that we can increase voter turnout in California?
Curbing low voter turnout in California starts with you, the voter. So making sure that you vote is the most straightforward way we can increase voter turnout. So far, we've talked about why low voter turnout is a problem, the demographics of who doesn't vote, the barriers that are in the way of people that want to vote but can't, the lack of youth engagement, what's been done to make voting easier, and whether it has or has not worked, and some potential solutions for increasing voter turnout. Voting is an integral part of our nation's democracy and allows us to stay civically and politically engaged. So what are you going to vote in the next election?